All right, let's jump right into this. Picture it, it's 1962. The Cold War is absolutely at its peak. Now, what if I told you that at that very moment, the highest levels of the US military were drafting a top secret plan? And this plan, it involved attacking their own country, their own people, just to start a war. It sounds like something out of a conspiracy theory, right? Well, this one is a documented fact.
And this phrase right here, a helpful wave of national indignation, that comes directly from the declassified document. It's literally how the Joint Chiefs of Staff described the public outrage they wanted to create by staging attacks on Americans. And why? To get everybody on board for a war with Cuba.
And that really is the central question of all of this, isn't it? What on earth could possess the most powerful military leaders in America, the very people whose job it is to protect the country, to come up with a plan as terrifying as Operation Northwoods?
Okay, so let's set the scene. The date is March 13th, 1962. A top-secret memo hits the desk of the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. It's from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top brass, and what's inside is, well, it's a deeply disturbing proposal. The details of this plan were just wild. They were talking about lobbing mortars into American bases, faking hijackings of civilian planes, even blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay. They even floated the idea of a terror campaign on American soil, and the plan was to blame all of it on Cuba to justify an invasion. So why? Why go to such extreme lengths? Well, this was the military's answer to what the U.S. government was calling the Cuba problem. The idea of a communist country just 90 miles off the coast of Florida was seen as a completely unacceptable threat. And this really paints the picture of just how dramatic that shift was. Before 1959, Cuba was basically an American playground, run by a dictator who was friendly to the U.S., and American businesses were making a killing. Then Fidel Castro's revolution happens, and boom, it's a communist state that seizes those businesses, and even more terrifying for Washington, becomes a potential Soviet military base right on America's doorstep. So the first response from the U.S. was to try and hit Cuba where it hurts, in the wallet. They slapped on a trade embargo, stopped buying Cuba's #1 export, sugar. But, and this is a huge but, it totally backfired. It didn't bring Cuba to its knees, it just shoved Castro right into the arms of the Soviet Union, the exact thing the U.S. was trying to prevent. So they had to move on to more secret, covert plans.
And this is where you can really start to see the desperation building. As each plan failed, the next one just got more and more extreme. This obsession with ousting Castro was leading the U.S. government down a really dangerous road.
This timeline, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Castro takes power in '59. Then in April '61, the U.S. gives the green light to the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a complete and utter disaster, a massive embarrassment for President Kennedy. So, still reeling from that, JFK kicks off Operation Mongoose. But when that doesn't get the job done, the military steps in with its own, even more radical idea, Operation Northwoods.
And Operation Mongoose was a massive covert effort. We're talking hundreds of spies on the ground, submarines doing reconnaissance, propaganda campaigns, sabotage of Cuban infrastructure, and literally dozens of plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. The U.S. was throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the problem, short of an all-out invasion.
And some of these plots were just unbelievably bizarre. Get this, the CIA actually went out and hired the American mafia, who were furious about losing their casinos in Havana, to try and take out Castro with poison pills. It sounds like something from a spy movie, but it just goes to show how desperate and, well, unconventional the methods were becoming. But here's the thing, none of it worked. Castro was still in power. So in the military's mind, all these secret operations were a failure. The only thing left to do, they figured, was a full-scale U.S. military invasion. But for that, they needed a reason the American public would get behind. And that is the entire logic behind the Northwoods document. So, they came up with this chillingly bureaucratic term in the memo, legitimate provocation. Let's be clear about what that means. It was their code for creating a completely fake staged event, a false flag, that would give the U.S. military what looked like a justifiable reason to invade Cuba. And the scenarios they dreamed up were just sinister. They talked about staging attacks on their own base in Guantanamo. They actually referenced the Remember the Maine incident from the Spanish-American War, proposing to blow up their own ship. But the most chilling part, they planned to detonate bombs in American cities like Miami or D.C., And they explicitly said they would wound actual American citizens to make the whole thing look real.
This direct quote from the document is just breathtaking. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign. They even proposed sinking a boat full of Cuban refugees trying to get to Florida. The cold, calculated cruelty of this plan is just hard to wrap your head around. It was pure deception and violence, aimed at both Cubans and Americans alike.
So you have this absolutely shocking proposal sitting on the table. What happens next? Well, this is where the story takes a critical turn, and it leads to a major showdown between the nation's civilian leadership and its military. President John F. Kennedy shut the plan down, flat out. No. The military, led by the Joint Chiefs, was itching for a fight, pushing for direct intervention. But Kennedy, who was still feeling the burn from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, saw this plan for what it was: unthinkably reckless and far too dangerous. He rejected it completely.
And there were real consequences for this. The gap between JFK and his military leaders grew even wider. President Kennedy later refused to reappoint General Lyman Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, which was a pretty clear message about his disapproval of the man who pushed so hard for Operation Northwoods.
So the operation never happened. But the fact that it was ever officially proposed, written down, and seriously considered by the top military leadership, well, it leaves us with some really unsettling questions about power, secrecy, and just how far a government might go. It's a truly dangerous precedent. And this brings us to a really tough question. How do we look back on this? On one hand, you could say the system of checks and balances worked. The president stopped a crazy military plan in its tracks. But on the other hand, you could argue that the United States was just one person, one different president away from its own government manufacturing a war by attacking its own people.
And let's be really clear about something. The argument here was about the how, not the what. JFK rejected Northwoods, but he was every bit as committed to getting Castro out of power as the military was. Remember, he was the one who authorized the Bay of Pigs and Operation Mongoose. They all wanted the same outcome. They just disagreed on how far they were willing to go to get it.
And that leaves us with this final, lingering question. The fundamental structure of the political military machine that came up with a plan like this, it hasn't really changed all that much. So you have to wonder, if the government felt a threat was big enough, if the conditions were just right, could something like this happen again?